Hello, my name's Adam Donohue and I'm the Head of Client Services at Vanguard. With me today I have Irene Guiamatsia from Investment Trends. Welcome, Irene.
Thanks, Adam. I'm Head of Research at Investment Trends. So Investment Trends is a global market research firm. We provide business insight to the leading financial services organization across the world. Thanks again for having me here, Adam.
Pleasure. So over 10 years, Vanguard Investment Trends have partnered together to deliver insights to Australian investors. Today we're really excited to talk about the new report, the SMSF survey for 2022, which Vanguard Investment Trends have put out together. Can you tell us a little bit about how you set up the research, please, Irene?
Yes, certainly. So to provide a bit of context, this is research executed in the first quarter of the year. So we surveyed some 2,400 SMSF investors in Australia. And so this makes it, to our knowledge, the largest scale and longest running survey of SMSF investors in Australia.
So Irene, what were some of the key headlines in the report, please?
Yeah, so really three key areas that we like to call out. The first one is that SMSF establishment rates are picking up. So more people are setting up SMSFs. The second one is really about an interesting and we believe lasting shift in the demographic profile. So SMSF investors are getting younger. And then finally, when it comes to asset allocation, there are some constants, but there are also a few things that are changing. And one key highlight is actually the different view of SMSFs when it comes to portfolio construction within their super and outside of the SMSF, which is really interesting.
That is. And what would you say are some of the drivers in the growth of the establishment rates?
The results really show with quite a bit of emphasis that the key driver and the key motivation for setting up an SMSF is the desire for control. So it is quite evident from our perspective that a growing number of Australians are wanting to be in the driver's seat when it comes to actually contributing to building their retirement future. And so when you look at the desire for control, over 2/3 of respondents picked that option as being the key motivator for their action of setting up an SMSF.
Sure, okay. And just in regard to your second finding, there's a real demographic shift happening. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, certainly. So yes, SMSFs are getting younger. So the research shows that on average, SMSFs recently established were about 46 years of age. And so if you look at the super balance, it's about $340,000. And so this sits in really stark relief as contrasted to what we saw even just 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, SMSFs were established at about 50 years of age on average. And so this is a trend that we see no sign of abating. It's likely to continue.
Well, that's interesting. So from the Vanguard side, it's consistent with what we're seeing about younger investors getting more involved in SMSFs and investing in general. We looked at the ASX data and that tells us that more younger investors get involved, particularly millennials and Gen Zs, and they've all started their investing journey during the pandemic. From a Vanguard perspective, we really think investing should be available to everyone. So it's great to see this younger generation getting involved. Just picking up your point around importance of control, can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, certainly. Perhaps what we can add there is that it's actually a driver not to be conflated with hyperactivity. In fact, what we see SMSFs, when we look at SMSFs' view or approach towards their, asset allocation and portfolio construction, we tend to see that they have a really long-term buy and hold approach, as opposed to sort of rebalancing quite often. So that's really good to see that they have this perhaps more measured or considered view around portfolio allocation. Maybe if I just rewind a little bit and pick up on one of the other points that you made around expanding the access to, that sort of investment vehicle, if you will. It's also an expansion that we see across, various dimensions. So we spoke about age earlier. There's also a sort of gender lens that needs to be put on.
And that came out in the report as well?
Absolutely. So what we see is that investors are not only getting younger, but they're also more likely to be female. And it's great to see expansion in that direction as well.
That is interesting insight. One thing that we found was obviously everybody wants to beat the market, but it's harder than we think, as history tells us, especially in times of turbulence. So from a Vanguard perspective, we really go back to 4 principles that investors over time are more likely to achieve their goals if they're investing in a broadly diversified portfolio. They've got appropriate asset allocation for their risk tolerance and their goals. They're thinking about long-term investing, and they're having a low-cost approach. So every investor wants to buy low and sell high, and we've actually done some research of our own in this area. So we actually took the last 50 years of markets, and we used worst-case scenario data of investing at the peak right before the dips. And this included 3 of the worst bear markets during that time. So what we found is that investors that hold their nerve through this period actually would have benefited from returns of almost 11% per annum. And this is despite having invested right at the market peaks. Yeah. So we really think that that highlights the point of buying and holding rather than just trying to time the markets.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Just on a sort of high level, if we look at the sort of key asset classes that SMSF investors go to construct their portfolio, and the first one is equities, and then the second one is cash. Maybe the final point I'll make is just maybe highlighting around property. We sort of know that there is a strong bias in our community, in our investor community towards property in Australia, and SMSFs are no different. However, the way their desire for exposure to property manifests tends to be a little bit within the SMSF to, be to a smaller extent, but primarily outside of the SMSF portfolio, so really in the non-SMSF portfolio, they would sort of access that property exposure as well.
Thanks, Irene. Yeah, that's interesting because the asset allocation of the Vanguard SMSF investors is actually quite different to what you're saying. From our point of view, we have around 60% in managed funds, 25% in ETFs, 15% in cash, and 1% in shares. So we believe this highlights that our investors are really thinking around a broadly diversified portfolio investing for the long term.
So that's really interesting, Adam. And I guess this begs the question of the forward-looking outlook. So back in March, when we conducted the research and markets were already moving sideways, what SMSF investors were telling us was that there were 3 key factors that were likely to influence their investment decisions going forward. And those 3 were rising interest rate, inflation, and market volatility.
Well, look, there's no doubt we're facing uncertain times. I mean, recessions and bear markets can be troubling to cope with for everybody. Regardless of where the markets go from here, we at Vanguard always look at staying the course. So we'd like to thank you, Irene, for your time today and also for Investment Trends partnering with us. And we'd also like to thank our investors for joining us today. Thank you.